name is Officer Jeanne Manchuso with the Concord Police Department. I'm excited to be a part of this program with the Concord Public Library. I'll just start with a little bit about myself. I've been with the town of Concord for just under 13 years. I've been a police officer for over 6. Currently, I am one of the school resource officers with Officer Kevin Gina. I primarily work at the middle school, and he's up at the high school. I'm excited to be here today, so we're going to get right into the book. I hope you enjoyed it so far. I'm going to be reading chapter 5. So here we go. Mr. Penderwicks believed in long walks. One of his favorite sayings was, "Take a walk, clear your head." Skye figured that that's why he had sent her on a walk with Jane. Geoffrey, Beatty, while he and Rosalind aired out the kitchen, for Skye to clear her head, and maybe, too, for Skye and Geoffrey to clear the air between them. Now that Skye hadn't already apologized for calling Geoffrey rich and stuck up, and not that Geoffrey hadn't said that it was all right, forget about it, but that was as far as they had gotten conversationally, and since then they had barely looked at each other. So here was Skye slogging away behind Geoffrey and Jane, listening to them gab on like old friends. It was enough to make a person sick. Of course, Skye wasn't jealous, and she didn't wish anyone would pay attention to her or anything. It was just such a waste of time being with people who talked about boring stuff. Geoffrey was taking them to see something special, or so he had told Jane. He led them across the cottage grounds, away from the hedge and toward the high stone wall that marked the other boundary line. Once they reached the wall, they turned to the left and followed it for another 100 yards until they came to a wooden gate where Geoffrey called a halt. The gate was almost as high as the wall, much too high to see over, but there were knotholes in the wood. Geoffrey told Jane to put her eye to one of the knotholes and look through to the other side. It was just a field, thought Jane. There should be a bull over there, said Geoffrey. Nope, no bull. Let me look. Jane moved aside to make room for Geoffrey. You're right. I don't see him either, he said. He must be in the barn today. Skye tapped her foot impatiently. The truth was, she thought, there was no bull. That boy was just trying to impress Jane. He gored a man right in this very field, said Geoffrey, looking back at Jane. Oh, gasped Jane. Did the man die? Almost. If Geoffrey heard Skye's scornful snort, he didn't let on. Gagny told me all about it. The man's guts fell out of his stomach, and it took 3 doctors to stitch him back up again. Some people signed a petition to have the bull shot, but the police said it was just the man's fault because he was trespassing in the bull's field. I feel sorry for the man, but just the same, it would be awful to be shot, said Jane. Besides, Gagny said the bull's more dumb than mean. It's not right to shoot someone because they're not intelligent, said Geoffrey. He could be hiding in a corner. Jane looked through the gate again. The knothole was too small to give much of a view. There's a ladder in the wall farther down. We could climb it and look over the top, Geoffrey said. He turned and looked at Skye. Do you want to come? Skye didn't, but because she figured that Geoffrey didn't want her to, she shrugged and said, sure, okay. So off they went, Jane and Geoffrey talking, and Skye trailing behind, wishing she had never gone through that stupid tunnel and bumped into this jerky boy. Stay close to your sisters, Rosalind had told Batty, and Batty had stayed pretty close while they were all walking. But when Geoffrey stopped at the gate, Batty drifted away and hid behind a bush, not just because of Geoffrey and how he kept asking her questions about Hound. Nothing made Batty feel shyer than questions, but also because of the leave me alone or I'll break your arm look on Skye's face. Batty wouldn't have minded either of those things as much as Hound had been there to keep her company, but he would have had to be on a leash, and Hound thought of that being on a leash meant playing tug-of-war. Batty peeked out from behind the bush. Geoffrey and her sisters were leaving. She knew she would follow them, but first she wanted to see what was on the other side of that gate. She had been too far away to hear about the man-goring bull. She crept out from behind the bush and over the gate and put her eye to a knothole. What she saw was a field full of clover and daisies with a barn over the other side. Now, Batty knew all about their horses and their needs. There was a horse farm near the Penderwicks home in Cameron, where Mr. Penderwick often took Batty to feed carrots to her favorites, Eleanor and Franklin. So she knew a perfect field for horses when she saw one, and while she didn't see any actual horses to the knothole, she figured that didn't mean there weren't any. They were probably hiding out of her view. Horses could be shy, too. The gate was locked and too high to climb over. There was, however, a gap at the bottom big enough to crawl through. Batty carefully wrapped her wings around her shoulders, flopped to the ground, and wriggled under the gate. Alas, no horses, not even a shy one. Batty looked this way and that, but she was alone on the side of the wall. Oh well, she would pick up daisies instead and put them back and take them back to Rosalind to make a chain. She headed toward the largest clump of daisies and bent to her task. All was at peace while Batty picked flowers and hummed a song about kangaroos. Above, the birds wheeled cheerfully across the sky. Below, the worms slid happily through the soil. In between, the summer breeze softly ruffled the clover and daisies. But soon the peace was disturbed. Across the field from Batty, the barn door swung open as if shoved by something very strong. And here it came, strong, yes, big and black. The king of the field, the bull, sauntered out of the sunshine and proudly surveyed his realm. Sky lagged far behind Jane and Geoffrey as she could without being too obvious. By the time she finally bothered to catch up with them, Jane was already halfway up the ladder in the stone wall. Jane looked down at her and said, "Isn't Batty with you?" Sky had already forgotten about Batty, but wouldn't admit it for the world. Watching over Batty was always the job of OAP, or Oldest Available Penderwick, and without Rosalind, Sky was definitely the OAP. "She was hiding behind a bush when we were at the gate," said Geoffrey. More showing off, thought Sky, who hadn't noticed Batty behind the bush. "Maybe I'll be able to spot her from up here," said Jane. She climbed at the top of the ladder and hoisted herself onto the wall. "It's wide enough up here to walk." "Be careful," said Geoffrey. "It's a long drop." "I don't see Batty," said Jane, surveying the cottage side of the wall. "She probably went back to see Hound." Sky hoped it was so. As annoying as Batty could be, losing her altogether wouldn't be so terrific. "Maybe," said Jane doubtfully. "I'll go back to look for her," said Geoffrey. "I'll go with you in a minute. Just let me look for the bull." Jane turned around to look in the field. "Oh, there he is. He must have come out of the barn." "Isn't he big?" said Geoffrey. "Huge." So there really was a bull, thought Sky, but she couldn't believe he was as awful as Jane and Geoffrey were saying. It was probably a small bull, maybe even a fat old cow. She would go up and see for herself, but Geoffrey was in between Sky and the ladder, and she'd stand there all day rather than ask him to move. "Go up and look," said Geoffrey, stepping out of Sky's way. "After you." She wasn't going to fall for his phony politeness. And then Jane started to scream. Batty was watching a purple and orange bug when Jane screamed. The bug had fallen off a daisy, and Batty had lain down on her stomach to make sure it landed safely. Batty recognized the scream as Jane's, and as Jane had a habit of screaming more often than Sky, for example, Batty wasn't worried. However, she did look up from the bug. A bull is so much larger than a bug that at first Batty didn't understand what she was seeing. She looked back at the bug, who had now safely scuttled around another daisy stem, then looked back again, hoping the black monster would be gone. Not only was it still there, it had come a step closer. It was only 15 feet away. "Nice horsey," said Batty hopefully. Now this bull had never actually gored anyone. It was true that a tourist had sneaked into the field and dropped his expensive camera in front of the bull, who quite rightly stepped on it and smashed it to pieces. But that hadn't been enough of a story for anyone. The first person who told it added a part about the bull scratching the tourist's leg, and the second who told it turned the scratch into a gouge, and so on, until by the time Cadney repeated the story to Geoffrey, the poor tourist had a gaping stomach wound. When Geoffrey told Jane, he hadn't exaggerated all that much, just changing one doctor to 3. Nevertheless, gore or not, the bull was not sociable, and he particularly didn't like visitors lying in the middle of his favorite daisy patch. It was also possible that he didn't like being called a horsey, because now he shook his horns and stomped his foot at Batty. Batty knew this was no horse. She suddenly knew lots of things she hadn't known a minute ago, like she should never have gone under the gate alone, and she should have never disobeyed Rosalind, and she would be a good, dutiful child for the rest of her life if that terrible beast would stay away from her. For now, she knew she had better just lie very still and wish that Hound were there and Daddy wouldn't let anything hurt her. "Oh, Daddy, oh, Hound, oh, somebody, please help me." To Batty's very grateful relief, a moment later, help was on its way, heralded by the noises of Jane and making sure she ran at Olympic speed along the top of the wall toward the wooden gate. The noises weren't exactly shrieks or shouts either. They were more like a sound a fire truck would make if it was trying to speak. It wasn't until Jane reached the gate and skipped to a halt, still on top of the wall, that anything she was saying made sense to Batty. "Bull, bull, up here, leave her alone." The bull swung around toward the wall, and Batty dared to raise her head and look at Jane, who was jumping up and down and waving her arms like she was directing traffic. "Oh, that's right, you mean..." Old bull, pick on someone your own size, screeched Jane. Then Batty heard what she hoped was more help coming from the other side of the gate, though mostly it sounded like Skye and Geoffrey arguing. A moment later, however, Geoffrey did slide under the gate, with Skye right behind him. Stay still, Batty. Rescue is nigh, yelled Jane. Nervously wondering what nigh meant, Batty watched as Geoffrey and Skye raced across the field. They had split apart. Skye was coming toward Batty. Geoffrey was heading toward the bull. Geoffrey shouted, Yeah, come at me, bull. Poor bull, he had simply wanted to quietly munch on daisies in the sunshine, and now his private paradise was full of active and extreme noisy creatures. He hadn't the wits for it. He looked from Jane to Geoffrey to Skye and back to Batty, clearly deciding which to eliminate first. His beady eyes fixed on the one closest to him, the one who had dared pick up his daisies. He lowered his head and horns and began a lumbering march to Batty. Batty saw him coming. She made herself as flat as possible, almost a pancake, then closed her eyes and wondered how much it would hurt. Next thing she knew, she was being lifted like a sack of flour and thrown across someone's shoulders. She opened her eyes. It was Skye. Skye had gotten to her before the bull. Now Geoffrey was shouting again, Take that, and with each that came the sound of a small stone hitting the bull, trying to get his attention away as Skye could get away with Batty. And it was working. The bull was not going to put up with stones being thrown at him, no matter how small. He turned to face that new enemy. From the wall, Jane screamed, Now, Skye, run! Carrying Batty, Skye took off at a lopsided run while the bull pawed the ground and lowered his gigantic head at Geoffrey. Charge! Batty had never had a hero outside her own family. She had always figured that her father and Rosalind were enough heroes for anyone. But as she bounced crazily up and down on Skye's shoulder during that wild ride to safety, a new hero came into her life. She watched Geoffrey work that bull as though trained from birth as a torreader. This way and that he went, darting, weaving, spinning, jumping, always heading from Skye and Batty. As the bull followed, frantic to rid himself of this exasperating intruder, slam! Skye threw Batty to the ground and shoved her under the gate. As Skye started through, after all, Jane howled at Geoffrey. All in free, Geoffrey, run for your life. In the field, the final race began. Skye struggled to her feet and planted herself at the gate's knothole. Batty stayed on the ground and peered underneath. Jane kept to her perch on top of the wall. All three watched, terrified, as Geoffrey dashed toward them, the bull only yards behind. Oh, hurry, Geoffrey, run, came shrilling from the three throats. Closer, closer, closer. In one swift motion, Geoffrey was on the ground under the gate and up again. He and Skye grabbed one of Batty's arms and lifted her up as Jane leapt off the wall. Go, said Geoffrey, and they all took off just as the bull crashed his great horns into the gate. The gate shook on its hinges, and the bull followed with rage, but nobody looked back. They never wanted to see that gate again. The children were halfway back to the cottage before they felt safe enough to stop. Skye called a halt, and everyone collapsed, panting under a tall pine tree. For a long time, there was only silence as people caught their breath and made sure that they had their arms and legs. Batty, perhaps unwisely, was the first to speak. I left my daisies in the field, she said. Skye raised herself up with murder on her face. Don't kill her now, just when we've gone to all that trouble to rescue her, said Geoffrey. Skye said, Batty, of all the stupid things you've ever said, that was the stupidest. Why did you go into that field anyway, said Jane. I thought it would be horses, said Batty, checking her wings, which had torn in several places when Skye pushed her under the gate. Well, it wasn't horses, you idiot. You almost got us killed, said Skye. We would have been if it wasn't for Geoffrey, said Jane. Well, Geoffrey blushed and looked at the ground. Geoffrey, you're a true hero. Stop, Jane. It's up to me to thank him. I'm the OAP. Skye stood up and faced Geoffrey, who looked at the ground harder. I thank you on behalf of the Penderwicks family. Even though I kicked you when you went under the gate before me, and even though I could have taunted the bull just as well as you. Skye, said Jane. Skye took a few seconds to concentrate, then went on. You were brave and intelligent, and you saved Batty's life. She took a great gulp of air and then rushed on. I was a jerk before, and I apologize. And this is my real apology, because Rosalind and Jane wrote the first one. Skye stuck out her hand. Geoffrey looked up from the ground and stuck out his hand too, and they shook. Jane said, their hearts laid bare by the near loss of a loved one. The two enemies declared a truce. I want to shake his hand too, said Batty. Geoffrey shook her hand and then Jane's hand for good measure. A crashing noise from a nearby tree made everyone jump. Probably just a squirrel, said Geoffrey. Just the same, do you think the bull could break down the gate, said Jane. No, said Skye, but she looked questioningly at Geoffrey. No, he said positively. Maybe Daddy should go make sure it's safe, said Batty. Batty, no, you can't tell Daddy about the bull. You can't even tell Rosalind, said Skye. Why not? Because they'll think Jane and I didn't look after you properly. You didn't. Promise you won't tell, said Jane. Can we do Penderwick family honor, said Batty. That's just for the family, Batty. You know that, said Skye, trying to point to Geoffrey without him noticing. Ever since Rosalind and Skye had made up a ceremony after reading a book about a family named Bastable, only Penderwick sisters have done it or seen it. It's okay. I'll leave, said Geoffrey. He doesn't have to leave. He saved my life, said Batty. He's an honorary Penderwick. Honorary, corrected Jane. What do you think, Skye asked Jane. What would Rosalind think, said Jane. Since it's a question of life and death, I think she'd agree, said Skye slowly. All right, Geoffrey, you can stay and watch us do it, but you have to promise you won't tell anybody, even Cagney. Okay, said Geoffrey. No, you've got to swear solemnly, said Jane. I solemnly swear not to tell anyone about what you're about to do. That's good enough, said Skye, making her hand into a fist and holding it out. We, the 3 younger Penderwick sisters, will never tell Daddy or Rosalind about Batty and the bull. We'll come up with a good story about how Batty's wings got torn, and although it will not be the strict truth, it will not be an evil lie, because Batty has learned her lesson and will never go into the field again. Right, Batty? Right, said Batty. Okay, I'm done, said Skye. Jane put her fist on top of Skye's, and Batty put hers on top of Jane's. This I swear by the Penderwick family honor. Suddenly there came another crashing noise from nearby, and the children knew it was much too loud. Once again Batty was thrown onto someone's shoulders, this time Geoffrey's, and everyone took off running. Within seconds, the pine tree was deserted. So there was no one to see the large, black, not terrifying, dog when he arrived a moment later. Mr. Penderwick had been wrong about the latch on Hound's gate. It wasn't dog-proof, or at least not hound-proof, and when the bull was chasing Batty, Hound had sensed her danger with his own peculiar brand of ESP and busted out of his gate. But where was Batty now? Hound sniffed around the pine tree, puzzled. She had just been there. He lifted his nose and, caught the scent. Relieved, the faithful and through, Hound trotted away after Batty. That was the end of Chapter 5. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the book. It's about to get exciting, so I think I'm going to read the rest of the book as well. Thank you so much for listening. I hope everyone stays healthy, and I'll see you later.